There's a moment somewhere over occupied France in the summer of 1943 when every assumption about aerial combat is about to die. You're at 18,000 feet in a P-47 Thunderbolt. Your altimeter needle sits steady. Your oxygen mask feeds you thin, cold air. Below, the French countryside spreads like a detailed map. Patchwork farmland, the silver snake of the Seine, dark smudges marking German airfields. Up here, you can see threats coming from miles away. You feel safe. You're about to be proven catastrophically wrong. In the operations room at 8 Fighter Command headquarters, a young intelligence officer is updating the loss board. Another red pin goes into the map over Pas-de-Calais. That's the 14th P-47 lost this week. All at high altitude. All to German fighters that saw them coming and struck with impunity. The Luftwaffe pilots barely mention these kills anymore. They're routine. Another American, another bounce from the sun, another brief burst of 20mm cannon fire, and another empty chair in some mess hall in England. Somewhere in that vast sky, the rules are being rewritten. Not by generals or theorists, but by desperate men who've watched too many friends die following doctrine. The revolution won't come from above. It'll come from below, 50 feet below to be exact, at an altitude where one mistake means instant death, where radar goes blind, where every German advantage evaporates into shock and fire. This is the story of how American fighter pilots learned to fly at the height where birds live, and in doing so, changed warfare forever. The numbers told a story written in blood and twisted aluminum. Between June and September 1943, American fighters operating over occupied Europe lost 214 aircraft. Not to mechanical failure, though the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines occasionally quit without warning. Not to running out of fuel, though the math between range and combat time kept pilots awake at night. To German fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 weren't just aircraft. They were instruments of precision violence, perfected through 4 years of constant combat. Their pilots had learned their craft over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They knew every trick, every advantage, every killing technique that worked in the thin air between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. They owned those altitudes like landlords collecting rent. The Americans were just tenants who kept dying. Lieutenant Robert Johnson sat in the briefing room at Halesworth Airfield watching another mission plan unfold on the wall map. Bomber escort to Schweinfurt. Ball-bearing factories. Strategic target. The red line showing the route looked simple enough. Cross the channel, penetrate deep into Germany, stay with the bombers, fight off interceptors, come home. The reality was uglier. Every mission followed the same pattern. The formation would cross the coast at 22,000 feet, and within minutes, someone's radio would crackle, "Bandits, high-end climbing, 3 o'clock." Then the Luftwaffe would arrive. They'd been watching on radar. They'd climbed to 28,000 feet, position themselves between the sun and the American formation. They'd pick a P-47, usually one slightly out of position, and dive. 6,000 feet of acceleration, closing speed over 500 miles per hour. A 2-second burst of cannon fire. The Bf-109 carried a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, each shell the size of a beer bottle. Then they'd zoom climb back to altitude before the Americans could respond. The P-47 pilots called it getting bounced. The intelligence officers called it combat losses within operational parameters. The guys in the cockpits called it murder. Johnson had seen it happen to his wingman 2 weeks ago. One moment they were flying formation, the next moment there was just smoke and falling debris. He never even saw the German fighter that did it. Just gone. The doctrine was clear, absolute, and apparently suicidal. Maintain altitude advantage. Every training manual, every briefing, every squadron commander hammered the same lesson. Altitude equals energy equals survival. Never give up your height. The pilot who controls the vertical controls the fight. Except Americans weren't controlling anything. They were dying while following the rule book. Major Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group. He was 29 years old and looked 45. Combat does that. Ages you in ways that have nothing to do with calendars. Every empty bunk in the barracks, every personal effects box shipped home to grieving families, every letter he wrote beginning, "I regret to inform you," they all left marks. By late August 1943, Zemke had developed a habit of walking through the squadron areas after dark, counting the lights in the Nissen huts. Fewer lights each week, not because of blackout discipline, because there were fewer men to turn them on. The tactical situation was simple and impossible. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, 7 tons of Republic Aviation's finest engineering, capable of absorbing damage that would disintegrate lighter fighters. Its 850 caliber machine guns could shred anything they hit. The R-2800 engine generated 2,000 horsepower. None of that mattered when Luftwaffe pilots with 4 years of combat experience could position themselves at altitude, choose their moment, and strike with overwhelming advantage. The bomber crews were even worse off. They'd watch their fighter escort evaporate under German attacks, then face the interceptors alone. B-17 gunners reported seeing P-47s spin down in flames while the formations droned onward toward their targets. The strategic bombing campaign was built on the assumption of fighter protection. That assumption was becoming harder to maintain with every mission. Something had to change. The alternatives were unthinkable: suspend daylight bombing operations, accept unacceptable losses, or keep feeding young pilots into a meat grinder that doctrine said they should be winning. Zemke started thinking about the forbidden question, the one that could get you laughed out of any tactical planning session. What if altitude was the problem? The idea came to Zemke during a sleepless night, staring at loss reports. Not a brilliant flash of inspiration, more like the slow realization that drowning men need to try something different than what's pulling them under. Every tactical manual said the same thing: height equals life. The fighter that starts higher can dive to attack, building speed and surprise. The fighter that starts lower is already defeated. He'll burn energy climbing while his opponent positions for the kill. It was physics. It was proven. It was gospel. It was also getting everyone killed. Zemke thought about naval warfare. Submarines didn't fight on the surface where they could be seen. They dove deep, used the ocean to hide, struck from surprise. What if fighters could do something similar? Not go higher where the Luftwaffe was waiting, but lower where nobody expected them. The counter-arguments formed immediately in his mind. Flying low meant you couldn't see threats approaching. One navigation error and you'd crater into French farmland before you could react. German flak batteries could track slow-moving targets at low altitude. Recovery from any combat maneuver required altitude. Without it, there was no margin for error. Every point was valid. Every point assumed the current approach was acceptable. Zemke looked at the statistics again. In the past month, his group had lost 18 pilots, 18 young men who'd followed doctrine perfectly and died anyway. The acceptable loss rate for maintaining current tactical employment was apparently all of them eventually. He made a decision that could end his career.
Orchestrated narrative structure across 10 thematic sections systematically. On September 24th, Zemke quietly pulled aside 3 of his most experienced pilots, Captain Walker Mahurin, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, and Captain Gerald Johnson. They met in his quarters, not the briefing room. No official record of the conversation would exist. Next mission, Zemke told them, after you've completed bomber escort and you're heading home, I want you to try something different. The 3 pilots waited. Zemke had their attention. Drop down, all the way down. Stay low across France, see what you find, see if you can get home. How low, Mahurin asked. As low as you're comfortable with. And if we crash? I'll write the letters, blame it on me. Unauthorized tactical experimentation. But if it works, Zemke didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The 3 pilots looked at each other. They'd all lost wingmen. They'd all attended too many memorial services. They understood what Zemke was asking. Try something insane or keep doing what wasn't working. They agreed. The morning started like every other mission. Pre-dawn briefing, target maps, threat assessments, weather reports. The 56th Fighter Group launched 48 P-47s to escort B-17s attacking submarine facilities at Emden. Standard high-altitude profile, 22,000 feet over the target area. The bomber escort went as expected. Sporadic German interceptor activity, no losses, everyone home by early afternoon. Mission successful in every measurable way. But Mahurin, Johnson, and Gerald Johnson had other plans. As the formation crossed back over the French coast heading for England, the three pilots broke formation. They reported radio trouble, a common enough occurrence that nobody questioned it. Then they nosed over and dove. At 15,000 feet, the dive felt normal. Standard combat descent, building energy for a potential engagement. At 10,000 feet, it started feeling aggressive. Most combat maneuvering happened above this altitude. At 5,000 feet, it felt wrong. Every instinct screamed to level out, regain altitude, maintain the advantage. At 1,000 feet, it felt suicidal. They kept descending. The three P-47s leveled out at 200 feet above the French countryside, then dropped lower still. Trees became individual features instead of green carpets. Farm buildings resolved into structures with windows and doors. Startled farmers looked up at the sound of Pratt & Whitney engines roaring overhead, then dove for cover as American fighters screamed past at 350 miles per hour. Everything happened faster at this altitude. At 20,000 feet, you had minutes to assess threats, make decisions, execute maneuvers. At 200 feet, minutes became seconds. A slight navigational error meant hitting a hillside. Momentary inattention meant flying into a church steeple. The world became a blur of sensory information rushing at them at 6 miles per minute. Hedgerows, roads, villages, all merging into a continuous tactical problem that demanded absolute focus. Then Mahurin's voice crackled over the radio. Airfield, 11 o'clock, looks active. They'd stumbled onto a Luftwaffe base near Beauvais. It wasn't on their target list because fighter groups didn't attack airfields. That was a job for bombers. Fighters fought other fighters in the air, not on the ground. But there it was, a German airfield with FW Focke-Wulf FW-190s lined up like toys on a concrete apron. Fighters being refueled, rearmed, prepared for the afternoon patrol. Ground crews working methodically, secure in the knowledge that they were 60 miles behind the front lines, protected by radar networks and early warning systems. They never saw the three P-47s coming. Mahurin led the attack run. The formation came in so low that their propellers chopped the grass at the field's edge. 24.5 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, 144 pounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary rounds walking across the airfield at point-blank range. The first FW-190 exploded as tracer rounds found its fuel tanks. The second erupted when bullets detonated its ammunition. Ground crews scattered, sprinting for cover that didn't exist. A fuel truck vanished in a fireball that rolled black smoke 300 feet into the air. From engine sound to explosion, 11 seconds. The German Flak batteries never got a shot off. By the time the gunners reached their positions, the three P-47s were already past the airfield, screaming away at maximum speed, hugging the terrain. The three pilots made it back to Halesworth. 0 losses, 4 confirmed FW-190s destroyed on the ground, and a tactical revelation that would reshape the air war over Europe. That night, Zemke listened to their debriefing with the expression of a man watching a curtain lift on a new world. The physics made sense. The reaction times made sense. Most importantly, the survival rate made sense. The next morning, he authorized expanded low-level operations. No official directive, no change to the mission orders, just quiet permission for experienced pilots to experiment with aggressive low-level tactics after completing their primary assignments. Within 2 weeks, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed 23 German aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe had started reporting phantom attacks, American fighters appearing from nowhere, attacking with devastating violence, then vanishing before defenses could respond. The revolution had begun. Flying at 50 feet wasn't just flying low, it was exploiting physics in ways that transformed every German advantage into a liability. The Luftwaffe's early warning network was sophisticated. Freya and Würzburg radar stations positioned across occupied Europe could detect Allied bomber formations 80 miles away at altitude. They'd track the incoming raid, calculate speed and heading, then vector Bf-110 and Fw-190 fighters to intercept positions. The system worked beautifully when targets flew high. It failed completely when targets flew low.
Radar waves travel in straight lines. The Earth curves. Between those two facts lies a blind spot called ground clutter, the confused mass of radar returns bouncing off terrain, buildings, vehicles, anything solid near the surface. Radar operators learned to filter out ground clutter because otherwise their screens would be useless snow. At 50 feet, American fighters existed entirely inside that filtered noise. They were invisible. A German radar operator watching his scope would see Allied bomber formations at 20,000 feet, nice clear returns. He'd see German interceptors climbing to meet them, textbook interception geometry. What he wouldn't see were the P-47s screaming across France at treetop level, approaching German airfields at 6 miles per minute, completely undetected until they were inside visual range. Inside visual range meant too late. A German fighter pilot sitting in his cockpit at a forward airfield, preparing for patrol, lived by radar warnings. At high altitude, incoming American fighters would show up on screens 3 to 5 minutes before arrival. That gave him time to start engines, taxi to the runway, take off, climb to fighting altitude, and position for interception. At 50 feet, his first warning was the sound of R-2800 engines howling over the trees. From sound to impact, 11 seconds. Not enough time to sprint to your aircraft, not enough time to reach the flak guns, not enough time to radio a warning, barely enough time to understand you were about to die. American pilots started catching German fighters with wheels still chucked, pilots still conducting pre-flight inspections, mechanics still working on engines. The Luftwaffe's sophisticated operational procedures, designed around radar-directed interceptions, collapsed into chaos when the enemy stopped playing by altitude rules. German flak crews trained on high-altitude tracking. You'd watch a bomber formation approaching at 180 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, calculate lead time and elevation, fire where the target would be in 6 seconds. It was predictable mathematics. A P-47 at full throttle doing 350 miles per hour at 50 feet destroyed those calculations. The closure rate was twice as fast. The angular velocity across the gun sight was triple. By the time an 88mm shell reached where you'd aimed, the Thunderbolt had traveled a quarter mile past that point. Light flak, the 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons, required visual tracking and smooth following. At 50 feet, you gave them neither. You were a blur that appeared and disappeared before the gunner's brain could process what his eyes had seen. Tracers would reach out, searching, but you'd already passed beneath them, behind them, around them. The Germans started reporting that American fighters were somehow dodging flak in real time, as if the pilots could see the shells coming. They couldn't. They were just moving too fast for Second World War fire control to track. Say a Bf-109 pilot spots a hedge-hopping P-47 and dives to engage. He's got altitude, he's got position, he's got the kill lined up perfectly. Every tactical advantage says he wins this fight. Except at 50 feet, there's no forgiveness. Every combat maneuver, a hard turn, a maximum G pull, a split S reversal, risks him flying into terrain. He's making life-or-death decisions in fractions of seconds, while the American pilot ahead of him is comfortable at this altitude because he's been flying here for weeks. The Luftwaffe trained for air combat at altitudes where you had thousands of feet below you, room to recover from mistakes, space to complete maneuvers, altitude you could trade for energy. Nobody trained them to dogfight at the altitude where birds get nervous. Most German pilots chose survival over kills. They'd line up the shot, see how close the ground was, and pull up. The psychological calculation shifted from, can I kill him, to, will killing him also kill me? At 20,000 feet, the hunter was confident. At 50 feet, the hunter was terrified. The prey, meanwhile, was right at home. American pilots discovered they could use geography like submarines use depth. German fighter inbound, drop into a river valley and follow the curves. The Bf-109 pilot either loses visual contact or follows you into a maze of fills where his speed advantage becomes a liability. You know the valley bends left in 3 seconds because you can see it. He won't know until he's already committed to a straight-line pursuit.
Villages became tactical assets, fly straight through at rooftop height, using buildings as shields. Church steeples, water towers, factory chimneys, everything became potential cover. The Luftwaffe had owned the empty sky. The Americans colonized the landscape and turned it into a weapon.
French civilians reported hearing American fighters before seeing them. The sound would bounce off hills and buildings, creating acoustic confusion about where the aircraft actually was. By the time you pinpointed the sound, the P-47 had already passed.
Physics didn't care about tactical doctrine. And at 50 feet, physics was on America's side. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't designed for this. Republic Aviation had built it as a high-altitude interceptor, a 7-ton monster optimized for escort missions at 25,000 feet where turbochargers and oxygen systems mattered. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower, but all that power was calibrated for thin air and stratospheric performance. When pilots started bringing these machines down to treetop level in late 1943, they came back with damage that shouldn't have been survivable. Shredded belly panels from tree strikes, punctured oil coolers from branch impacts, landing gear mechanisms jammed with vegetation. One pilot landed with a 6-foot oak branch wedged in his wheel well. The aircraft were surviving things they shouldn't survive, which meant Republic's engineers had accidentally built the perfect low-altitude fighter. They just needed to finish the job. The armor modification came first. Starting in December 1943, Republic began adding quarter-inch steel plating to the P-47's belly and lower engine cowling. This wasn't protection against bullets. It was protection against France itself. At 50 feet, trees weren't obstacles you avoided. They were obstacles you might clip and hopefully survive. Telephone wires weren't visible until you'd already hit them. Stone walls appeared in your path with zero reaction time. The belly armor meant that when, not if, you scraped across something solid at 350 miles per hour, you might keep flying afterward. Engineers reinforced the oil cooler housing after 3 incidents where pilots punctured their cooling systems on tree strikes and limped home with engine temperatures pushing failure limits. The modification added 17 pounds to the airframe, but saved multiple aircraft from what should have been fatal damage. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski demonstrated the modification's value on March 15, 1944, when he clipped a tree during a low-level strafing run. The impact tore away part of his belly fairing and jammed a branch through his landing gear, but the armored structure protected critical hydraulic and fuel lines. He flew home with tree bark still embedded in his aircraft's skin. The gun sight modification addressed a different problem. The standard N9 reflector gun sight was calibrated for deflection shooting at altitude, leading a maneuvering target thousands of feet away, accounting for bullet drop and relative motion in 3 dimensions. At ground level, your targets weren't maneuvering. They were stationary, parked aircraft, locomotives, fuel trucks, supply convoys. You needed a sight that could acquire targets instantly in the 2-second window you had them in view while traveling at 6 miles per minute. By February 1944, Republic began installing modified K-14 gyroscopic gun sights with adjusted ranging. The new sights essentially turned the P-47 into a gun that could aim itself. Put the pipper on the target, squeeze the trigger, and 8.5 caliber Brownings delivered 144 pounds of ammunition per minute directly into whatever you'd marked. The convergence point was adjusted too. Instead of converging at 300 yards, optimal for air-to-air combat, the guns were set for 150-yard convergence. At that range, all 8 gun streams merged into a killing column that could saw through locomotive boilers, crack open fuel tankers, and detonate ammunition trucks. The wing modifications solved the bombing problem. The P-47 could carry bombs, but standard high-altitude release procedures didn't work at 50 feet. Drop a 500-pound bomb at that altitude, and the blast would kill you as efficiently as it killed the target. Engineers developed skip bombing techniques, borrowed from Pacific theater operations. You'd approach a bridge or bunker at maximum speed, release at the last possible moment, and let the bomb skip like a stone across water, except it was skipping across concrete, straight into whatever you were targeting. The P-47D-25 variant that rolled out in March 1944 came with reinforced wing mounts specifically designed to handle the violent stress of these attack runs. Pulling out of a 400-mile-per-hour dive at 50 feet subjected the airframe to forces that could break weaker aircraft. The reinforced structure meant Thunderbolts could do it repeatedly without structural failure. The training evolution represented the most crucial modification, not to the aircraft, but to the pilots flying them. By April 1944, replacement pilots arriving in England went through a new qualification course at Atcham before joining operational squadrons. They'd fly navigation runs at 50 feet across the English countryside, learning to read terrain at speeds where hesitation meant death. Instructors would set up ground targets, old trucks, painted barrels, decommissioned equipment, and train pilots to acquire, track, and fire in 1-second windows. They'd practice formation flying at hedge height until operating at that altitude felt normal instead of suicidal. The instructors were combat veterans who'd survived 3 months of the real thing over France. Their lessons were simple and brutal. Altitude kills you. The Germans own everything above 5,000 feet. Go there and die. Speed saves you. The faster you're moving at low altitude, the fewer weapons can track you effectively.
The P-47 can absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. Trust the aircraft. It'll bring you home even when it looks like it shouldn't fly. Terrain is a weapon. Use it. Hills, valleys, buildings, everything becomes tactical advantage at 50 feet. Never fly the same attack pattern twice. Never approach from the same direction. Never attack at the same time. Predictability is fatal. The psychological conditioning was as important as the mechanical skills. Pilots had to learn not just to tolerate flying at extreme low altitude, but to embrace it, to feel safer at 50 feet than at 20,000, to understand viscerally that down was up, that the ground was protection, that everything the training manuals said was backwards. Some pilots couldn't make the adjustment. They'd try a few training runs, realize they were more terrified of the ground than of German fighters, and quietly request transfer to bomber escort duties. Nobody judged them. Everyone understood that hedge hopping required a specific mindset that not everyone possessed. But for those who could make the adjustment, who could rewire their survival instincts to see safety in what looked like suicide, the modified P-47 Thunderbolt became the deadliest ground attack aircraft in the European theater. Colonel Hubert Zemke had spent 6 months quietly perfecting the treetop tactic, rotating pilots through qualification courses, studying intelligence reports on German airfield locations, analyzing patrol schedules, refueling times, typical operational procedures, building a systematic understanding of when and where the Luftwaffe was most vulnerable. Now he was ready to unleash everything at once. Intelligence confirmed that Jagdgeschwaden 2 and Jagdgeschwaden 26, 2 of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, were rotating squadrons through forward bases in northern France. The Germans thought these fields were safe, tucked 60 miles inland, protected by flak batteries, covered by radar networks that should provide ample warning of any attack. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Zemke launched a coordinated strike involving 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from 3 fighter groups, the 56th, 78th, and 353rd. No bombers to escort, no high-altitude sweeps, just pure, low-level hunting. The formation split up after crossing the French coast, dropping to 100 feet, then 50, thundering across the Norman countryside in 4-ship flights. French resistance spotters later reported the ground shook. Farm animals panicked, windows rattled in their frames. The first flight hit Évreux airfield at 06:47 hours. 16 Bf-109s sat on the ground in various states of readiness, some taxiing toward the runway, engines already running, some still being refueled by ground crews who'd started their morning routine 20 minutes earlier.
Several had pilots climbing into cockpits, preparing for the dawn patrol that would never happen. The P-47s materialized out of the morning haze, doing 360 miles per hour. The German gunners never reached their positions. The radar operators were still trying to understand the confused returns on their scopes. The pilots in their cockpits looked up at the sound of engines and saw death arriving at propeller height. 90 seconds. That's how long the attack lasted. In 90 seconds, 11 Bf-109s transformed from operational fighters into burning wrecks. Oil smoke rolled across the airfield, thick and black. Secondary explosions rippled through ammunition stores. The P-47s pulled up and were gone, already racing toward their next target before the survivors could even radio a warning. The beauty of the coordinated strike was the timing. The Luftwaffe's command structure depended on centralized control and radio communication. When Evru got hit, they tried to warn other bases, but the Americans were already there. Bernay Airfield attacked 8 minutes after Evru. Beaumont-Le Roger, 4 minutes after Bernay. Luftwaffe controllers frantically vectored fighters to intercept threats that had already struck and vanished. It was like trying to swat mosquitoes in the dark while the mosquitoes systematically burned down your house. By 0820 hours, P-47s had hit 7 different airfields across a 40-mile radius. The German pilots who managed to get airborne found themselves trying to chase targets they couldn't see, flying at altitudes where one mistake meant instant death. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's original 3 experimental pilots from September, led a flight of FW-190s at Conch Airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were standing beside their aircraft discussing the day's patrol assignments when Johnson's flight screamed over the boundary fence at 50 feet. Johnson gun camera footage captured what happened next. It's difficult to watch even 80 years later. FW-190s erupting in fireballs, pilots sprinting for cover, fuel trucks exploding, spreading burning gasoline across the flight line, mechanics diving beneath vehicles. One pilot, caught in the open, simply vaporized when 50 caliber API rounds detonated the ammunition in the aircraft beside him.
Johnson's after-action report was clinical. Destroyed 4 aircraft on ground, probably destroyed 2 more. Heavy damage to fuel storage and maintenance facilities. No enemy fire encountered. Time over target, 11 seconds. 11 seconds that erased 2 years of Luftwaffe training, maintenance work, and operational capability. The coordinated strike expanded beyond airfields as the morning progressed. Fighter groups started hitting anything that moved toward the front lines. Trains became priority targets. Locomotives were easy to spot from the air and impossibly vulnerable to .50 caliber fire. Hit the boiler with armor-piercing rounds, and the resulting steam explosion would wreck the entire engine. Truck convoys learned to avoid daytime movement entirely. The P-47s would catch them on roads with nowhere to hide, nowhere to disperse, and systematically work down the column from front to rear. Burning trucks became roadblocks, trapping the vehicles behind them. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, supply warehouses. If it supported German military operations, it became a target. The hedge-hopping Thunderbolts had evolved from fighter aircraft into strategic weapons, severing the logistical connections that kept the Luftwaffe operational. The week-long April offensive, what American pilots started calling the Chattanooga choo-choo runs after they began specializing in locomotive destruction, claimed 47 confirmed German aircraft destroyed on the ground, 23 locomotives destroyed, and countless trucks, fuel depots, and ammunition stocks turned into craters. The cost? 3 P-47s. 1 to Flak that got lucky. 1 to a power line the pilot never saw. 1 to engine failure on the return flight. The loss ratio was 15-1 in favor of the Americans, and suddenly every Luftwaffe base commander in France was screaming for more flak guns, more camouflage, more anything that might stop the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts that could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating violence, and vanish before any defense could respond. But perhaps the most telling detail came from German radio intercepts. Luftwaffe controllers stopped using standard tactical language. The reports became frantic, almost panicked. Low-flying aircraft everywhere, cannot maintain operations, require immediate reinforcements. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had no idea how to fight back. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces. On April 19, 1944, he sat in his office at Luftwaffe headquarters reviewing loss reports with the expression of a man watching his Air Force bleed to death. The numbers were catastrophic. Not the losses themselves. Aerial combat always produced casualties. But the nature of the losses. Aircraft destroyed on the ground along with their fuel trucks, ammunition, and ground crews. That was hemorrhaging capability faster than Germany's collapsing logistics network could possibly replace. Galland issued Directive 487 to all Jagdverband commanders in France. Relocate aircraft dispersal areas at least 800 meters from runways. Increase flak coverage on approach paths. Establish visual observer networks in villages surrounding every airfield. It was a tactical band-aid on an arterial bleed, and Galland knew it. The flak repositioning happened first because it was easiest. Luftwaffe ground forces dragged 37mm and 20mm automatic cannons away from airfield perimeters and positioned them a kilometer out, hoping to catch the P-47s before they reached attack range. It didn't work. The Americans simply flew lower, using terrain folds and tree lines to mask their approach until they were inside the flak envelope. By the time guns started tracking, the Thunderbolts had already fired and were screaming past at speeds the gunners couldn't match. Several pilots reported that German flak would open fire on where they'd been, not where they were going, desperately tracking ghosts. Worse, positioning flak batteries in open fields made them targets. P-47 pilots started hunting the guns themselves, strafing positions with .50 caliber fire that killed gun crews without destroying a single aircraft. One German flak battery commander near Dreux reported losing 17 men in 3 weeks without scoring a single hit on an American fighter. After that report circulated, flak crews started abandoning their positions when they heard aircraft engines. Better to be court-martialed for cowardice than vaporized for loyalty. The observer network created its own problems. The Luftwaffe recruited French civilians, some willing collaborators, many coerced, to watch roads and fields near airfields and telephone warnings when they heard aircraft engines. It gave the Germans maybe 30 seconds of additional warning, just enough time for pilots to sprint away from their aircraft, which meant they lived, but their planes still burned. Survival versus operational capability, an impossible choice.
The French resistance identified the observer system within days and turned it into a weapon. They started feeding false reports, sending Luftwaffe personnel scrambling to dispersal areas for ghost attacks while real P-47s hit different bases entirely. Some resistance cells coordinated their false reports to create maximum confusion, simultaneous warnings from 8 different locations, forcing the Germans to choose which threats were real. By mid-May, the observer network had become so polluted with misinformation that base commanders stopped trusting it. They'd receive warnings and have no idea whether American fighters were actually coming or if it was another resistance deception. The dispersal tactic represented the most desperate measure. Instead of parking aircraft in neat rows near runways, efficient for maintenance and rapid launches, German ground crews started hiding individual fighters in tree groves, barns, and camouflaged revetments scattered across the countryside. It saved aircraft from strafing runs, but it destroyed operational readiness. A Bf-109 hidden in a farmer's barn 2 kilometers from the runway needed 20 minutes to reach the flight line, get fueled, armed, and airborne. The whole point of a fighter base was rapid response, interceptors that could scramble within minutes of a threat appearing. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe to choose between protecting their aircraft and actually using them. They chose protection, which meant that even when German fighters survived, they weren't flying. Operational sortie rates dropped by 60% across all bases implementing dispersal procedures. The aircraft existed, but they might as well have been in Germany for all the good they did. Galland tried one more countermeasure in late May, Operation Werger, a plan to use FW-190s fitted with additional armor and heavy cannons to hunt the hedgehoppers. The theory was that these heavily armed fighters could fly low-altitude patrols and catch P-47s during their attack runs when the Americans were focused on ground targets and vulnerable to surprise. It failed spectacularly. The armored FW-190s were slower and less maneuverable than standard variants. At 50 feet, those disadvantages were fatal. The additional armor that should have provided protection just made them easier targets, heavy fighters trying to dogfight at an altitude where speed and agility mattered more than firepower. In the first week of Werger operations, the Luftwaffe lost 6 modified fighters without scoring a single kill.
American pilots reported the heavily armed FW-190s were actually easier to evade than standard models, slower to turn, slower to accelerate, sluggish in vertical maneuvers. One P-47 pilot described it as fighting an elephant with boxing gloves. The program was quietly canceled. The 6 modified FW-190s were returned to standard configuration. The pilots who'd flown them requested reassignment to regular interceptor duties, citing equipment inadequacies. What they really meant was, don't send us to fight at 50 feet in aircraft that can't survive there. By June 1944, Luftwaffe commanders in France had accepted a grim reality. Their aircraft weren't safe on the ground, they weren't safe taking off, they weren't safe landing, and the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime, with impunity. German radio intercepts from this period show the psychological toll. Controllers stopped issuing confident tactical directions. Instead, transmissions became tentative, almost questioning. Possible enemy aircraft reported vicinity Abbeville. All units maintain readiness. Update, no visual confirmation. Stand down. Wait, another report from Beauvais, investigating. The Luftwaffe had lost more than operational capability. They'd lost certainty. Every engine sound became a potential threat. Every routine patrol might be an ambush. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical destruction. Air superiority had transformed into air terror, and there was no doctrine, no tactical manual, no historical precedent for how to counter an enemy that refused to fight where you could see them coming. The human cost of hedge hopping wasn't measured in casualties alone. It lived in the minds of pilots who learned to exist at an altitude where one moment of inattention meant instant death. Goodson was crossing the Loire Valley at 50 feet, scanning for targets, when his windscreen exploded inward. Blood, feathers, broken plexiglass. A crow had collided with his aircraft at 300 miles per hour. The impact shattered the front panel and embedded glass shards in his cheeks and forehead. Half blind, wind herring at his eyes, he kept the stick steady and climbed out of the death zone. He landed at an emergency strip with blood streaming down his face and glass fragments embedded in his skin that medics would spend 3 hours removing. After that, pilots started calling birds flying flak and developed an instinct for spotting their behavior. If you saw them scatter suddenly, something was there. Trees, wires, another aircraft. The birds knew the terrain better than you did. Trust them.
France's rural electrical grid was a web of death strung between wooden poles at exactly the altitude American pilots were flying. The wires were thin, nearly invisible against the landscape, tensions strong enough to slice through aluminum like cheese wire. Between April and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s to power line strikes, not combat losses, not even counted as enemy action, just administrative casualties filed under struck obstacle during low-level flight. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a line near Chartres that wrapped around his propeller and pulled down 3 telephone poles before it snapped. The jolt nearly tore the engine off the airframe. He made it 10 miles before the vibrations forced him to bail out. Rescue crews found the wreckage with 40 feet of copper wire still tangled in the propeller blades. After O'Brien's incident, squadron commanders started briefing pilots on power line locations using maps annotated by French resistance spotters. It helped. Losses to wire strikes dropped by half, but you couldn't map every wire in France, and all it took was one you didn't know about. At altitude, if you died, it was combat, honorable. Someone would write your mother a letter about your bravery in the face of the enemy. At 50 feet, if you died, it was because you misjudged a hillside, or didn't see the chimney, or got distracted for half a second. Your wingman would report, flew into the ground, and everyone would know you'd made a mistake. That knowledge created a mental burden that some pilots couldn't carry. In May 1944, the 56th Fighter Group had 3 pilots request transfer to bomber escort duty, high-altitude missions, because they couldn't handle the ground-level stress anymore. One of them, a captain with 14 kills, told the flight surgeon he'd rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet than fly another mission at tree level. The surgeon approved the transfer without judgment because everyone understood. Some men were wired for altitude combat, some adapted to hedge hopping. Very few were comfortable with both.
Flying at maximum speed for 2 hours while constantly scanning terrain and threats created exhaustion that went beyond normal combat fatigue. Your body produced adrenaline continuously. Your eyes strained to track ground features rushing at you at 6 miles per minute. Your hands fought constant micro-corrections to keep the aircraft stable at an altitude where a 2-degree mistake meant death. Pilots would land after a hedge-hopping mission and find their flight suits soaked through with sweat despite flying in 50-degree weather. Some couldn't hold coffee cups steady for an hour after landing. Flight surgeons documented cases of pilots with hand tremors so severe they couldn't write their after-action reports. They had to dictate them instead. The medical staff started noticing patterns. Pilots who flew multiple hedge-hopping missions per day showed symptoms similar to extreme stress response: elevated heart rate that wouldn't normalize, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance even during downtime. One pilot startled violently when a mess hall door slammed, diving under the table before he realized where he was. The flight surgeons couldn't ground everyone showing symptoms. They lose half the qualified pilots. Instead, they established mandatory rest rotations: 3 days of operations, 1 day off. It wasn't enough to eliminate the stress, but it was enough to keep pilots functional. Then there were pilots who started taking unnecessary risks because they'd survived so many missions that they felt invincible. They'd fly at 30 feet instead of 50. They'd strafe targets in broad daylight that should have been bypassed. They'd attempt attack runs that had no reasonable probability of success. Squadron commanders watched for this carefully, because overconfidence at that altitude had a 100% mortality rate. It was just a question of when. Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots for a week in May after the pilot flew under a railway bridge instead of over it. Not because he'd violated regulations. There weren't really regulations for what they were doing, but because he'd stopped being afraid. At 50 feet, a healthy fear was the only thing keeping you alive. Lose that, and you became a statistic with your name on a telegram to your family. The Army Air Forces regret to inform you. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, who would end the war as one of America's top aces, described the mental state required for hedgehopping in his memoir. You existed in a state of controlled fear, not panic. Panic killed you immediately, but a constant awareness that you were operating at the absolute edge of survivable flight. Every decision had to be instantaneous and correct. There was no time to reconsider, no altitude to trade for mistakes. You lived in the half-second between what you saw and what you did about it. Some days, you felt like a god. Other days, you felt like a target. The only constant was the ground rising up to meet you if you hesitated for even a moment. Living at 50 feet meant accepting that survival was temporary, skill was insufficient, and luck mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. It meant learning to be comfortable being terrified. It meant understanding that the line between hero and casualty was thinner than the margin between your propeller and the treetops.
And it meant that every mission you survived was one mission closer to the statistical inevitability that would eventually catch everyone. Dawn was breaking over Normandy. On 5 invasion beaches stretching across 50 miles of French coastline, 156,000 Allied troops were hitting the surf in the largest amphibious assault in human history. Landing craft churned through rough seas. Naval gunfire thundered across the water. The entire operation balanced on one critical assumption. The Luftwaffe wouldn't show up. Not couldn't, wouldn't. Because American fighters would make any German attempt to reach the beaches a suicide mission. General Eisenhower had bet Operation Overlord, the invasion itself, on air supremacy. The hedge-hopping P-47s were about to cash that check. Before the first landing craft touched sand, 289 Thunderbolts were already screaming across northern France at treetop level, systematically destroying every Luftwaffe base within 150 miles of the coast. The strikes began at 04:45 hours, 90 minutes before H hour. The timing was surgical. Catch the Germans during their most vulnerable moment, right as they were preparing dawn patrols to investigate the invasion fleet that radar had been tracking all night. A group of Bf-109s was taxiing into takeoff position when 8 P-47s from the 78 Fighter Group materialized out of the pre-dawn gloom. The German pilots had their canopies open, checking instruments, completely focused on their pre-flight routine. They died without ever seeing what killed them. 18 Bf-109s destroyed in the time it takes to read this sentence. The burning wrecks blocked the runway. The surviving pilots abandoned their aircraft and sprinted for shelters as secondary explosions rippled across the field. The base commander tried to radio a warning to other stations, but his communications center was already in flames. At Beauvais, at Abbeville, at Amiens, the same scene repeated. German fighters burning before they could defend the beaches that were about to be lost. The coordinated nature of the D-Day strikes represented a level of sophistication beyond anything attempted before. Fighter groups didn't just hit their targets and return home, they maintained continuous sweeps. As one flight finished its attack and pulled off target, another was already inbound from a different direction. The Germans never got a respite. Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers screaming contradictory orders, trying to vector fighters to intercept threats coming from everywhere simultaneously. 06:20 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 at Lille Vendeville. The Germans attempted to launch a Staffel to attack the beaches. They got 4 aircraft airborne before P-47s hit the field. The 4 that launched were bounced by high-altitude P-51 Mustangs waiting above the cloud layer. None reached the coast. The systematic destruction wasn't just about killing aircraft, it was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will to even try. Every base that attempted to launch fighters got hammered immediately. Every pilot who reached his cockpit watched his squadron burn around him. The message became clear: attempting to interfere with the invasion was suicide. By 0800 hours, as American troops were fighting through the surf at Omaha Beach, as British forces were pushing inland from Golden Sword, as Canadian soldiers were securing Juneau, the Luftwaffe had managed to put exactly 2 aircraft over the invasion fleet. 2 reconnaissance planes. Both were shot down within minutes. Adolf Hitler reportedly spent the morning raging at his air commanders, demanding to know where the Luftwaffe was. The answer was simple: burning on airfields across France, destroyed by an enemy that had learned to kill air forces on the ground before they could fly. The operational tempo was brutal. P-47 pilots didn't fly neat 8-hour missions with rest periods. They flew, landed, rearmed, refueled in 20 minutes, and launched again. Some pilots flew 4 sorties before sunset. Ground crews worked with manic intensity. Armorers loaded ammunition so fast their hands bled. Fuel crews dragged hoses between aircraft, topping off tanks while engines were still cooling. Mechanics performed emergency repairs, patching bullet holes, replacing damaged panels, fixing hydraulic leaks in minutes instead of hours. Several ground crew members collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to medical tents. They woke up, refused to stay down, and went back to work. D-Day wasn't just being fought in the air and on the beaches, it was being fought by men in greasy coveralls who kept the aircraft flying through sheer determination.
As daylight hours progressed, the P-47s expanded beyond airfields to systematically destroy anything that moved toward Normandy: trains, truck convoys, fuel depots, bridges. If it could support a German counterattack, it became a priority target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski led a flight that caught a German panzer column attempting to move toward Caen. The tanks were buttoned up, crews inside, moving at road speed with no air cover because there was no Luftwaffe left to provide it. Gabreski's flight didn't have bombs, just .5 caliber API rounds, armor-piercing incendiary. They strafed the column from engine deck angles where the armor was thinnest. 3 Panzer IVs brewed up, the tanker's euphemism for catastrophic internal fires. Ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions. Black smoke rolled hundreds of feet into the air. The column scattered into tree lines and didn't move again until after dark. Multiply that scene across 50 different roads, and you understand why German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in 6 hours took 3 days. Luftwaffe sorties over Normandy on June 6th, 319. Allied sorties over Normandy on June 6th, 14,674. The difference was hedge-hopping. Every German aircraft that survived the ground attacks faced a gauntlet of low-level American fighters between their base and the battlefield. The few that made it through accomplished nothing. They couldn't protect their forces, couldn't attack the landing beaches, couldn't even provide reconnaissance. The invasion succeeded because the sky over those beaches belonged entirely to the Allies, and the sky belonged to them because P-47 pilots had spent 7 months learning how to kill an air force before it could fly. As the sun set on June 6th, the longest day, the beachheads were secured. 156,000 troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Europe had begun. And it had begun because American fighter pilots learned to fly at the altitude where doctrine said they should die, and discovered that sometimes survival requires breaking every rule. The hedge-hopping revolution didn't end when the war did. It rewrote the fundamental doctrine of how air forces think about close air support, battlefield interdiction, and what it means to control airspace. By August 1944, every Allied air force in Europe had adopted some version of the treetop tactics. British Typhoons and Tempests started flying similar low-level strikes against German armor and transportation networks. Soviet Il-2 Stormoviks, already designed for ground attack, refined their approach patterns based on American after-action reports shared through liaison channels. Even the Luftwaffe tried to copy the tactics in their few remaining operational sectors, but by then they lacked the fuel, the training time, and the aircraft to make it work. You can't develop proficiency at 50 feet when you're rationing aviation fuel by the gallon. The injury statistics validated the entire approach despite its brutal learning curve. Between April and August 1944, P-47 groups flying hedgehop missions destroyed 1,823 German aircraft on the ground, 115 locomotives, over 9,000 trucks and armored vehicles, hundreds of bridges and fuel depots. They lost 289 aircraft in the same period, 114 to flak, 87 to ground obstacles and mechanical failure during low-level flight, 67 to enemy fighters, 21 to unknown causes. A loss rate of roughly 15% over 5 months of the most intense combat operations in aviation history. Brutal numbers, but sustainable. More importantly, the aircraft they destroyed on the ground never killed Allied bombers, never strafed Allied troops, never contested the skies over France. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses, and by mid-1944, that was definitely not Germany. The Korean War saw American pilots applying hedge-hopping principles against North and Chinese forces with devastating effect. F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets screamed across the Korean countryside at tree level, hitting supply columns and airfields using tactics refined over France a decade earlier. The speeds were higher, jets versus props, but the fundamental approach remained identical. Fly low, fly fast, exploit terrain. Hit targets before they know you're there. The North Korean Air Force learned the same lessons the Luftwaffe had learned. Aircraft on the ground are helpless against an enemy that can appear from nowhere. Vietnam saw these lessons applied again when American F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs flew low-level interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The terminology changed. Nap of the earth flying replaced hedge-hopping, but the DNA was pure 1944 Thunderbolt tactics.
The same challenges emerged: wire strikes, bird strikes, the psychological toll of extended operations at extreme low altitude. The same solutions applied: reinforced structures, modified sites, intensive training, mandatory rest rotations. The details were different, but the fundamental lesson remained constant. Modern close air support doctrine still carries the fingerprints of those P-47 pilots. The A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s specifically for low-altitude ground attack, incorporated every lesson learned over France. Heavy armor protection underneath, redundant flight systems, weapons optimized for ground targets, training that emphasizes terrain masking and high-speed approaches. Air Force survival schools still teach the tactical principles that Hub Zemke's pilots discovered through trial and error. Altitude gives you visibility, but ground level gives you surprise. Speed at low altitude is better protection than maneuverability at high altitude. The ground is a weapon if you know how to use it. The specific aircraft changed, the weapons got more sophisticated, radar became ubiquitous, precision-guided munitions replaced area saturation, but the core concept of using terrain and speed to achieve tactical surprise remained gospel. The psychological legacy might be even more important than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign proved that conventional wisdom could be wrong, that doctrine written in peacetime might need to be thrown out when people start dying, that sometimes the right answer is the one that sounds completely insane. Hub Zemke got court-martialed exactly never for his unauthorized tactical experiments. Instead, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak clusters, and the Air Medal with multiple clusters. The Army Air Forces, and later the Independent Air Force, internalized a cultural lesson about innovation under fire. When faced with unacceptable losses, you don't keep doing the same thing harder. You question everything.
You test alternatives. You empower junior officers to experiment. That institutional flexibility became part of American air power doctrine, influencing everything from tactical development to acquisition strategies. Walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton today, and you'll find a P-47 Thunderbolt suspended from the ceiling. The placard talks about high-altitude bomber escort, the massive R-2800 radial engine, the 8.5 caliber machine guns that could shred anything they hit. It's historically accurate but incomplete. The real story of the Thunderbolt is that it became most dangerous when it flew lowest, when pilots pointed that massive nose at the ground instead of the sky, when it transformed from a high-altitude interceptor into a hedge-hopping predator that taught an entire generation how to fight at the altitude where physics and surprise mattered more than altitude advantage. 7 months, 50 feet, and a willingness to ignore every rule. That's how American pilots caught the Luftwaffe off guard. That's how they helped win the air war over Europe. That's how they proved that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is the courage to question everything you've been taught and try what everyone says is impossible. When they did, they spoke in understated terms about low-level work or ground attack missions. They didn't describe it as revolutionary because to them, it wasn't. It was just what they had to do to survive, to complete the mission, to bring themselves and their wingmen home. Francis Gabreski, who flew 166 combat missions and ended the war with 28 aerial victories, was once asked what he was most proud of. His answer wasn't about kills or medals. That I brought most of my pilots home. That when we tried something that should have killed us, we figured out how to make it work instead. That when the doctrine said go high, and we were dying high, we had the sense to try low. Everything else, the victories, the destroyed aircraft, the tactical evolution, that all followed from the simple fact that we chose survival over procedure. The last reunion of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, was held in 2019. 17 men attended, all in their 90s, most in wheelchairs, a few still sharp enough to argue about who destroyed what airfield on which date in 1944. They're nearly all gone now. The men who learned to fly at 50 feet, who revolutionized air combat by doing the exact opposite of everything they'd been taught, who proved that questioning doctrine under fire could change the course of history. But their legacy persists in every close air support mission flown today, in every tactical innovation born from necessity rather than theory, in every young pilot who learns that altitude is a tool, not a requirement, and that sometimes the safest place to be is right down on the deck, where the enemy never thinks to look.
The hedge-hopping campaign over France in 1944 lasted less than a year, but it fundamentally altered how wars are fought in the third dimension. Before, air superiority meant controlling the sky at high altitude. After, air superiority meant controlling every inch of airspace from the ground up. Before, fighters fought other fighters in aerial combat. After, the most effective way to destroy an air force was on the ground, before it could take off. Before, doctrine was written by theorists and tested in peacetime exercises. After, real innovation came from desperate men willing to question everything when survival demanded it. In the years since, military planners have studied the hedge-hopping campaign as a masterclass in tactical innovation. Business schools teach it as a case study in disruptive thinking. Leadership courses use it to illustrate the importance of empowering subordinates to experiment. But the real lesson is simpler and more profound. Sometimes the rules that keep you safe are the rules that get you killed. Sometimes survival requires doing the thing that every expert says is impossible. Sometimes the only way forward is down, all the way down, to the altitude where conventional wisdom stops making sense and only physics, speed, and courage matter. The P-47 pilots who learned to fly at 50 feet didn't set out to revolutionize warfare. They just wanted to stop dying. They wanted to complete their missions. They wanted to go home. That they changed history in the process is almost incidental. A side effect of necessity meeting innovation at 350 miles per hour, 50 feet above the farms and forests of occupied France, where American pilots learned that the ground wasn't the enemy, it was the weapon that would win the war.